listening to Mnemonic Insights, a podcast about environmental and workplace health and safety legislation. I'm Una Jefferson. It's often not as simple as just following the rules. Some companies aim for strict conformance with environmental and health and safety regulation, while others take their chances with non-conformance. Some companies go beyond conformance. What happens when two companies with different attitudes towards risk become one? Michael Bittner is the head of post-merger integration at Ramble Group, an engineering, design, and consultancy company. We spoke about different risk strategies, how to determine a company's attitude to risk, and how to integrate environmental, health, and safety systems when they are based on differing attitudes towards risk. Michael Bittner, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So I wanted to ask you about the challenges that come with a merger where companies have differing perceptions of risk. This is something that you've mentioned in some of your writings. I guess just to start off, how would you characterize the different types of attitudes to risk that you've observed?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, actually, just because it's so important for environmental and health and safety. You know, in the compliance world, there's a lot of gray area, and there are some companies that just cannot tolerate, one little piece of deviation from a standard, a corporate standard, or a legal compliance requirement. And there's other companies that kind of really don't care. As long as you're sort of close enough, that's good enough. And then there's people who kind of really don't care at all, right? And you see this in like say in the oil and gas industry, where it's a little bit of a stereotype, but you have the companies that are more like your exploration companies, and they're into fracking, and they kind of play quick and loose with the rules, and they're not real bothered by things like regulations sometimes. And then an oil major would buy one of these companies, and the company might be wildly successful as a business, but they have all sorts of non-compliance and maybe, regulatory correspondence or directives that they've totally ignored. And suddenly, an oil major buys them, and they're not going to tolerate that. And things really have to change. And, how do you get people to suddenly start obeying the rules when they've been used to just kind of making it work? Yeah, so you see it on the compliance side, but it's also on just the health and safety risk too, like how much attention do people pay to protecting their workers, for example.
Right. Would you say that with exploration companies, for example, would you say that the differing attitude to risk goes hand in hand with how long the strategic time frame of the company is? Or is it more about culture? Like, is it about how long they're planning to be around? And
that's a really interesting question. I think it probably has to do more with the culture of the company. But kind of what you're mentioning, though, sort of plays out in the private equity world sometimes, where private equity investors really only plan on holding an investment in a company for, let's say, 3 to 5 years, or maybe 10 years, and so. Whereas a private equity investor might correct a big non-compliance issue if it can really be a bad thing, they're kind of usually not really interested in spending money that's a good idea unless they have to. You know what I mean? So you see that a lot, where there are things that are technically wrong. There are risks that are left unmanaged because people just don't want to spend any money on it. And they think that, well, maybe in the ideal world, somebody would fix up this situation, but we're only going to be here for 3 years. So as long as there's no enforcement before we sell, why should we bother? It's really a function of the company culture. And the culture is really defined to a large extent by the attitudes of the leaders. And a leader can be the CEO or the senior managers and executives at a company, but if you think about it, a leader is really anyone who supervises another person or anyone who influences another person. And so regardless of your rank in the company, if you influence other people and you influence their behavior, then you are a leader. And your attitude towards safety or environmental compliance, worker protection, whatever, that forms culture. So the words that you use, the attention that you give the subject on your daily agenda, the way that you behave, whether you're a decent role model or not, really the emphasis that you place on safety or environmental performance, this creates culture.
Okay. And would you say that you've also observed differences in risk attitudes between companies that take proactive stances going beyond compliance and companies that take more of a compliance approach?
Yeah, definitely too. And sometimes it's a matter of sophistication. I mean, sometimes you have companies or facilities that, they'd like to do the right thing. They just really don't have the people that have the knowledge and the skills to really, be performing at a high level, but they want to do the right thing. So if you acquire a company like that, where you have a lot of people who want to do the right thing, they just kind of don't know how to do it, then if you're a good coach and if you're patient, you can give people systems and tools and insight and learning, and you can really help them evolve and become better, more valuable environmental and health and safety performers. The reverse though is also true sometimes, where if people kind of just don't get it, just don't care, then you can stand there and talk until you're blue in the face, and they're not going to change their behavior. What you really need to do is to get people to change their attitude and their behavior, and that can take a very long time.
I suppose one of the first steps to creating a strategy in that respect would be identifying the risk management strategy of another company. And maybe sometimes it's written out, but how would you go about determining the risk management strategy of a company?
That's a big question. How do you determine the risk management strategy? A lot of times we start with compliance, because that is job number one for environmental health and safety. So in a post-merger integration context, one of the best things you can do is a post-acquisition audit. And so really a detailed EHS compliance assessment of all of the major facilities. And a lot of times during due diligence, people will do a limited compliance review. But these limited compliance reviews are really only looking for large material issues, and they tend to have a materiality threshold, so maybe $50,000 or $100,000. Anything below that doesn't get reported. And then the compliance review is done at the end of the due diligence on-site, the site visit, right? So if the due diligence activities take 6 hours while on site, then the assessor will spend the last hour or hour and a half looking at compliance. So you don't really get a comprehensive evaluation of compliance and due diligence, although you can identify some big ticket items that are important to correct. So one of the best things to get your arms around risk is to do a comprehensive post-acquisition audit of all of the large high priority facilities. And it might take, 6 months or 9 months to roll through all of these facilities. And it does cost some money, to hire a consultant to do this for you. But at the end of the day, you get a lot of value out of it, because you have a comprehensive compliance baseline of all of your facilities. You have corrective action plans. You have a really good understanding of their compliance performance, of the people and how the program is structured and so forth. And then we often supplement that basic compliance assessment with a management system assessment. And that could be pretty high level, where you're not necessarily doing an ISO 14001 gap assessment. You're basically looking at sort of the cornerstones of EHS management. So how's the program structured? What's the organization look like? How much support does the EHS program get from the leadership? How are the roles and responsibilities doled out? What's the governance program look like? Do they have a decent emergency response program? Do they have a formal compliance assessment process and so forth? So that you can kind of look at the ISO or OSAS standards and come up with a short list of management system criteria that you're looking at. But those are really the two best ways to get at risk in a post-acquisition context. Number one, do that comprehensive compliance audit. And number two, while you're doing that, also look at the management system and how the program's structured and look for strengths and weaknesses there. And once you finish with those two things, then you've got a really good vision for the future of how to remake the company and integrate them into your existing operations.
Okay, and best practice aside, how common practice is this type of assessment?
I would say maybe 30% of deals.
Okay.
It's not something that every single company does. Your private equity investors often don't do that because, again, they're trying not to spend money. Your strategic investors who are an industrial company that's buying another industrial company, that's where you tend to see the post-acquisition assessment, the formal assessment. Pretty much every company, when they buy another company, they will send the buyer will send their people out into the field to tour the facilities, meet the people, and as they're going along, they'll write up observations and recommendations for improvement. So pretty much everybody does that, but really you get a lot more value out of the formal assessment than you do out of a bunch of people running around with notebooks.
Why do you get more value out of it? Because you have more information up front?
Yeah, you get the common baseline, so you can compare apples to apples. Usually, when you do a formal program, companies will hire a consultant to do that, and so the consultant's really doing the heavy lifting in terms of evaluating compliance, writing the report, and so forth. And then the people who work for the acquiring company, they can really focus on meeting the local staff, building bridges, assessing culture, figuring out how to correct the observations that the consultant's identifying.
Okay. And
so it's a more thorough look. Because the alternative is that you send out, you've got 3 people on your corporate staff, you've acquired 20 facilities, you send 1 person to each facility. That means each of your 3 people is going to 7 facilities. They're sort of writing up some kind of a trip report, but every one of them is going to look different. There's going to be this whole laundry list of recommendations, but you're not going to really have funding for them. And it kind of gets to be this big ordeal of sending people around the world, touring sometimes 3-4 facilities at once. And you really spend so much time touring and trying to communicate your observations that you never really get to the corrective action piece. Whereas if you do the comprehensive assessment program and you get a consultant to do that initial evaluation, then all of your energy as an acquiring company is focused on relationships, the future, corrective actions, and so forth.
And I assume from your article that you have seen this kind of assessment wrap up where big differences in risk perception have become apparent. What then?
Yeah, one of the big keys to successful post-merger integration is resources, and resources can be people and it can be money or investment. So if you do, when you do your roll-up, then you can for example, we had one project where we did, I think, 63 EHS compliance assessments over the course of 9 months. And these are pretty big facilities. And then we prioritized the findings like urgent, medium, or low priority. And then at the end, you can go to your senior management and say, hey, look, we did these 63 audits, and, in health and safety, we had 63 urgent findings, and we think it's going to cost $5 million to fix these urgent findings. So that's a very different conversation, than saying, oh, well, those guys in France, they just don't get it. There's that one facility. They're just in total noncompliance, and oh, here's another bad thing these guys are doing, right? That's a different conversation when you can prioritize findings and say, hey, look, we did these audits. We've got 500 findings. We can take care of 400 of them by ourselves between us and the facilities. But these 100 or these 85, these are urgent. And of them, 25 are urgent findings related to fire and explosion risk. And if any one of these findings, these observations goes wrong, we could have a major fire at one of our major facilities, and it could affect business continuity and shut down the facility. So we're going to need $5 million to correct all of these urgent findings. And if you can do that quickly and build a business case for improvement, you can often you have a much better chance of getting financing for those corrective actions than if you just kind of dribble in findings one after another and there's no priority assigned to them, and you just get this you always look like you're complaining about something as opposed to making a good coherent argument about business risk and how to fix it.
Right. And so this resourcing, this would go towards improving operations, but I assume there would also be some training involved. You mentioned that culture played a big role.
Yes, and so just kind of like human resources is always a big thing. Depending on the making sure that you have enough people to do a good job with post-merger integration, and to if the acquired facilities need to be brought up to your standard, that takes a lot of time. If there's compliance deficiencies that need to be corrected, that takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of things that it takes a tremendous amount of logistical effort to do a good job on post-merger integration. So job number one is making sure you have enough people to do a good job on post-merger integration and to run the EHS program. Depending on the deal, some companies really have very aggressive synergy targets, and synergies being code word usually for cost reduction, which is usually code word for staff reduction. So some deals actually, you will see like every single person in corporate EHS at the acquired company get let go, except for one or two. So suddenly you're minus 15 people at corporate EHS, but your company has doubled in size, let's say. It takes more people to do more work. So part of the trick then is making sure you have enough people. And then you have the issue too, where a lot of times when there's an acquisition or a divestiture, especially if it drags out for a while, then there's a lot of people who will start looking for other jobs because they don't like the uncertainty of being in a situation where they don't know if they're going to have a job and what it's going to be like in the future. And so people start looking around, and darn if some of them don't find better jobs or different jobs. And so sometimes you don't intend to lay off people. However, some of your best people find better jobs somewhere else. And then all of a sudden, poof, they're gone. And now you're shorthanded again. So that's a very big problem.
Would you say, as a general rule, the risk strategy of the acquiring company wins out? Or I shouldn't say wins out, because that's very adversarial, but becomes the operating strategy.
That's a good question, and I think it's important to note that the acquiring company doesn't always win or doesn't always prevail in the end. In the beginning, certainly the presumption is that the acquiring company, that they're going to implement their program, and that the acquired entity is just going to have to adapt to the new world order. And sometimes that happens, right? I mean, if a big company like if ExxonMobil or whatever, like Dow or DuPont, if they buy a small company that's only a few facilities, or look at like in the pharmaceutical sector where like your big companies are always buying little tiny companies, right? Then guess what? The little company's just going to have to suck it up and do it the way the parent wants to do it, because that's the way it is. But once the acquisition target gets to have some weight to it, some size to it, it's not a given that the acquiring company has a better system, right? Because sometimes the acquiring company, they don't have a better system. Sometimes the acquired company is the leader, and everybody decides to do it, in accordance with that way. There's one great example, and sometimes companies will split. So one company will have a strong program, and one company will have a weak one, and then they'll trade. So, great example from the pharmaceutical sector. Years ago, there was a pretty big acquisition, and like a $20 billion deal. And, the acquirer really had a very weak sustainability program, but the acquired company had a great sustainability program. And the reverse was also true. Like nuts and bolts environmental health and safety compliance, the acquirer had a great program, and the acquired company really had a fairly weak and immature program. So what they decided was the new company, the combined company, took the environmental and health and safety compliance programs of the acquirer and the sustainability program of the acquired company.
Okay.
And really worked very well for them, quite honestly.
So they were able to.
Interesting enough that.
Sorry?
I was just going to say, interestingly enough, the same comment kind of applies to the people. You would assume that the person who's the head of environmental health and safety for the acquiring company would automatically become the vice president of EHS for the new company, but that's not necessarily the case. And anybody can get that job, just like anybody can have the program that ultimately is chosen to be the gold standard.
Okay. Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have, but thank you very much for talking with us.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure. I know post-merger integration can be very challenging, and you often feel like you're making it up as you go along. But if you have a good plan, and you stick to your plan, and you're trying to identify risk and knit the two cultures together, and really relate to people on the other side, not as adversaries but as allies and coworkers, then usually you come out ahead in the long run.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Una. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Mnemonic Insights. You can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, or online at mnemonic.com, NIMONIK.com.